Charles Julius Guiteau, a man no one would have heard of but for a single act he committed in the summer of 1881 when he murdered the 20th President of the United States, James A. Garfield. Guiteau's strange life is considered in the recent Netflix series Death by Lightning, but the real Charles Guiteau story is even wilder than the series lets on. Guiteau's creepiness, his overinflated sense of self-importance, and his unhinged mental state come through brilliantly in Matthew Macfadyen's performance. But how close to Garfield's real assassin does the Guiteau of the series actually come? In today's video, I'll be combing through Netflix's Death by Lightning to answer precisely this question. So let's now take a look at the bizarre life of Garfield's killer. As always, I would like to humbly ask for a like under this video, a subscription to the channel, a comment, and if you could share my work with your friends. This is the third video in a series about Death by Lightning. The first is about how the show depicts Garfield's nomination, and the second is about how the show depicts Chester Arthur. In my Arthur video, I made a few small errors, and I pinned a comment at the top of the video with corrections. Be sure to check those out, and with all of that out of the way, let's dive in. The first episode of Death by Lightning opens in a warehouse inside the U.S. Army Medical Museum in the 1960s, where a worker accidentally drops a glass jar on the floor. As he picks it up, he notices the jar contains a human brain and the label Charles Guiteau, causing him to exclaim, "Who the F is Charles Guiteau?" I tried to find out if this specific story was true, but came up dry. However, I do know that the brain of the man who killed our 20th president is in fact kept in a jar in the U.S. Army Medical Museum, along with a piece of James Garfield's spine used as evidence in Guiteau's trial. The mystery of Guiteau's brain is revealed at the end of the final episode, but the question of who the F is Charles Guiteau is answered throughout the series. We first see Charles Guiteau as he is woken up in a dark, grimy lower Manhattan jail known as the Tombs. The year is 1880, and based on a scene with the jail staff, we learn Guiteau is serving time here over a misunderstanding between tenant and landlord, and the fact that he evaded arrest. The series' use of vague language here is likely intentional, meant to quickly signal to the viewer that Guiteau had a habit of skipping out on rent, hotel bills, restaurant checks, and other obligations, which we see examples of repeatedly throughout the series. In addition to borrowing money constantly from a wide array of benefactors and never paying them back, Guiteau managed to enjoy fine dining, wear expensive clothes, and stay at high-end hotels without having a penny to his name. In fact, here's a cool article I found from the Kalamazoo Gazette in 1877. Charles Guiteau, who lectured here a few evenings since on the Second Coming of Christ, was arrested at Detroit Thursday evening for jumping a hotel bill at Ann Arbor. It's probably fair to say that these years of posing as a man of wealth and import played a role in the construction of his own personal delusion, that despite living a life of one failure after another, he was in fact a great man. Guiteau's strange religious beliefs and sense that God spoke directly to him also played a role. It is during this 1880 conversation at the Tombs prison in which we hear a brief reference to the Oneida Commune, and a fairly graphic sex scene is shown to us. The series expands on this more in the final episode, and that is a crazy rabbit hole we will dive into later in the video. In any case, the series is correct to show Charles Guiteau incarcerated at the Tombs. However, this actually took place in 1874. Guiteau is soon released from the Tombs and greeted by his sister, Franny Scoville. While this specific scene appears fictionalized, it does a good job in relating to the audience the fact that Franny was Charles's one and only true friend and ally in life. Guiteau's father and brother believed Charles to be insane, but Franny often provided him with funds and tried to encourage him to pursue his dreams. The series suggests a tension between Franny and her husband, George, over brother Charles, but from what I read, Franny's husband, George Scoville, was supportive of Charles, even going so far as to later represent him at his assassination trial. During these scenes, Charles lays out his plans to found a religious newspaper called The Theocrat. This was truly one of Charles's projects, which he launched around 1871 when he left the Oneida Commune, although it seems to have fizzled out within 4 months. By this point, you've probably figured out that many of the events of Guiteau's life are smushed into the year in which the series takes place. This decision makes sense for the sake of the series, but as this video is concerned with the actual history, I'll point out inaccuracies along the way, including inaccurate dates. Guiteau is next seen trying to secure a bank loan for his newspaper. Unfortunately, the bank manager recognizes Guiteau as the crazed man who years earlier threw a paperweight at his wall. Guiteau denies this, but is soon kicked out of the bank. Did this exact scene happen? I found no evidence, though it establishes a key point about Guiteau. He was a man with a bad reputation, who was often unceremoniously ushered out of spaces he wasn't supposed to be in. After the bank, we see Guiteau encounter former President Grant as he emerges from a building to adoring crowds before the convention was set to begin in 1880. While it does help to establish the true fact that Guiteau initially supported Grant for president in 1880, it is a fabrication. Neither Grant nor Guiteau were in Chicago at the time of the convention. For a while, the series focuses on Garfield's nomination, a subject I explored in my first video on the series. During Garfield's speech at the convention, a scene of Charles Guiteau chopping wood is spliced in. Guiteau appears to be raging at the logs he's chopping when his sister touches his shoulder, only to have Guiteau turn around with the axe, seemingly poised to murder her. This story did in fact take place. Shortly after his stay at the Tombs, Charles moved in with his sister in Wisconsin, 5 years before the 1880 convention. Franny had asked Charles to cut up some wood one night, which he did, but he left the wood lying on the porch. And when Franny came out to pick up the pieces herself, well, I'll just let her explain what happened next.
As quick as I did that, he raised the axe, without any provocation or words. It was not so much the raising of the axe as it was the look of his face that frightened me. He looked to me like a wild animal.
It was in the aftermath of this incident that Franny tried to have her brother institutionalized, and in order to avoid this outcome, Charles ran away, though I didn't find any evidence he robbed his sister before leaving. The series chose to have all of this take place in Chicago so that Guiteau could be in the same city as the Republican convention when Garfield was nominated and be there to shake his hand as the candidate left the convention hall. In fact, Guiteau was in Boston that night, and what happened to him next was one of the craziest and most exciting parts of Charles Guiteau's life before the assassination. In the aftermath of his failed attempts to make it in a religious colony at Oneida, start a religious newspaper, as well as spend years on the road as a street preacher, Guiteau's interests switched from religion to politics. He intensely followed the events of the 1880 Republican Convention, supporting Ulysses Grant and spending hours in the Boston Library composing a campaign speech for the former president. Once news reached Boston that Garfield had been selected, Guiteau switched the name Grant out for Garfield and was determined to help the new candidate get elected president. Days later, Guiteau booked passage on the SS Stonington, headed for New York City. The ship left port at 9:30, and as it sailed southward, it drifted into a heavy fog. At 11:30 p.m., a ship's horn could be heard in the near distance, warning the Stonington of its passing. However, within minutes, the futility of this signal was ominously understood. Guiteau, who was standing on the deck, recalled another ship appearing suddenly in front of them, the Stonington's sister ship, the Narragansett, full of passengers on their way to New England. Within seconds, the Stonington plowed straight into the starboard side of the vessel, killing many sleeping passengers instantly and creating a massive gaping hole which filled with water. Passengers on the Narragansett barely realized what had happened when a boiler exploded and sent flames shooting across the well-oiled decks. Guiteau watched from the deck of the Stonington as men, women, and children leapt into the sea, some covered in flames. Although both ships were salvaged, the Narragansett testified to a night of pure horror. The Stonington was stabilized and towed back to a nearby port. The experience, according to Guiteau's later testimony at his trial, contributed to his feeling that God was protecting him, saving him from death in order to perform some great task on his behalf. I was pretty disappointed that this incredible story was left out of the series, but I can kind of imagine why it was. It would have probably cost a lot of money to film a double shipwreck, and considering Titanic's budget was over $200 million, I don't think Netflix was going to be shelling that much out. And even mentioning it would have made the viewers curious to see it depicted on screen, and would have left many annoyed when it was not, so probably just better to leave it out. Still, kind of sad about that. In any case, episode 2 follows Guiteau in Chicago and New York as he follows the campaign, trying at every opportunity to insert himself while also dodging police. The scenes here are generally composites of different stories about Guiteau, but the general theme of them is accurate, in particular the tendency Guiteau had to sneak up on people. Many witnesses who remembered him said that he would often appear out of nowhere. No one would ever notice him walking in, which I think is one of the creepiest details about this guy. Guiteau was often accosting high-profile Republicans like James G. Blaine and Chester Arthur in an attempt to become a campaign surrogate. Guiteau was particularly fond of Arthur, whom he attempted to approach on nearly 20 occasions, including at his home in Manhattan, clutching his Garfield against Hancock speech in hand. Arthur ultimately relented, though more likely from annoyance than in a jolly alcoholic fog as the series shows. When Guiteau finally got his chance to speak before a small gathering, he walked off the stage only after a few minutes, complaining of the heat. Still, he would use this brief appearance once Garfield was president to lobby for a job in the administration, namely consul to Paris. Episode 3 begins with a crazy part of Guiteau's life, which I couldn't wait to dive into in this video, namely the sex cult. As you might expect, Charles Guiteau's childhood was full of bizarre forms of religious fanaticism. His mother died when he was 7, and so he was raised by his father, who believed his special communion with God would guarantee him immortality. Young Charles drank in his father's ideas until he turned 18 and left for Oneida, New York. There, a friend of Charles's father named John Humphrey Noyes ran a utopian religious community based on an unorthodox Christian idea known as perfectionism. Perfectionism posited that through education and prayer, one could become morally perfect and free from sin. Noyes' ideas included the concept of complex marriage, which was based on the idea that monogamy was pernicious and unhealthy, and so his commune became notorious for the practice of free love among its members. You may have noticed that in the series, there are a lot of adults running around having sex, but there are no kids. That's because Noyes told members to engage in intercourse up to the moment of emission. I'm sorry for this part, but it's kind of weird and interesting, so I'm just going to let it fly. To Noyes, having lots of unprotected sex with many partners was a form of self-control as long as one could stop themselves right before the end goal, shall we say. In fact, he told his flock that it was like rowing a boat. If you stay near the shore, you'll be fine. It's only when you row near a waterfall that you find yourself in danger, and I really feel like I'm in danger right now. Charles spent a few years at the commune, but did not thrive there, mostly due to his aversion to hard labor and the community women's aversion to him. In fact, as the series correctly points out, community members nicknamed him Charles Guiteau. Frustrated with his experience at Oneida, Guiteau left, and the long, wayward journey that led to his sad destiny began in earnest. Episode 3 picks up the story at President Garfield's inaugural ball, into which Charles Guiteau has snuck. I was unable to uncover any evidence that this happened, but the fiction serves a purpose for the series. For one, we see a conversation between Guiteau and First Lady Lucretia Garfield, which actually took place at the White House. The dialogue in the series is mostly fictionalized, but it captures to a large degree the spirit of the real conversation which actually took place. Guiteau, in fact, did become a regular fixture of life at the White House in the early days of the Garfield administration, along with the scores of other office seekers that crowded there pleading for a job. It is true that Guiteau became notorious among the office seekers for his pushy behavior, stealing White House stationery and forging letters from administration officials to boost his credentials, all the while exaggerating his contributions to the election of the president. A scene in which Guiteau accosts Secretary of State Blaine in the middle of the night at his D.C. home isn't based on fact, but appears to be a variation on a story in which Guiteau accosted Senator John Logan at his hotel room and tried to get him to sign a recommendation letter. Fun fact, Blaine and Logan would be the Republican Party president and VP picks for 1884. Next, we see how Guiteau meets with the president in his office. The scene includes an in-depth conversation which shows Guiteau totally blowing his chance, acting awkward, and asking Garfield to teach him how to succeed. Guiteau did in fact have a face-to-face with the president, but all we know of this meeting comes from Guiteau's recollections, in which he claims the meeting went fantastic, as you would imagine. Nevertheless, the scene in the series is quite compelling and helps the audience grasp the Cain and Abel theme of the story. Two men of similar backgrounds with two very different life trajectories. The final insult for Guiteau comes from James Blaine, who, just as the series shows, shouts at Guiteau in Lafayette Park that he has no prospect in the Garfield administration. The real version of the story took place at the State Department, where Guiteau made frequent visits begging for a job, which drove Blaine to finally inform Guiteau that he would never receive a consulship to Paris. By now, Guiteau had been banned from visiting the White House, and was spending his days in Lafayette Park and his evenings lying in bed dreaming of his next move. It was during one of these late-night reclinings that Guiteau claims he had a vision from God, who told him the president needed to be gotten out of the way. Throughout the next period, as Guiteau prepared to assassinate the president, he continued to express no ill will towards him, and only spoke of the deed as removing him rather than killing him. In fact, it was this lack of ill will towards Garfield personally that inspired him to attempt shooting him during a church service at the Vermont Avenue Church so that his soul would go directly to heaven. Guiteau had earlier visited a local shop where he purchased a .44 caliber British Bulldog with an ivory handle, and I love the fact that the series names the precise model of gun used to kill Garfield. That's a fantastic attention to detail. The series also shows how Guiteau practiced firing the gun in a park near the Potomac River, which also lines up with Guiteau's own testimony in court. Episode 4 picks up Guiteau's trail on June 12th, when the future assassin attended a service at the Vermont Avenue Christian Church in Washington, pistol in hand. In the series, Guiteau sits directly behind the president, preparing to take his shot, when he is suddenly distracted by the image of Jesus and shouts at the pastor, "What know ye of Christ?" This line suggests that Guiteau identifies himself and the task God has supposedly saddled him with the Lord Jesus Christ. A later scene in which Guiteau confesses to a priest his trepidation over carrying out his divine mission carries a distinct Jesus at Gethsemane before the crucifixion vibe. But the real Guiteau, who was sitting further away from the president, actually shouted, "What think ye of Christ?" suggesting his statement may have been motivated by a theological disagreement with the pastor. Ironically, we find more evidence of this in Garfield's diary entry for that day, in which the president criticized the pastor for delivering, quote, "a very stupid sermon on a very great subject." The president also noted Guiteau's loud interruption, saying simply that a dull young man had shouted from the pews. Guiteau stayed until the end of the sermon, never firing a shot, but had determined to come back next Sunday. During the week, however, reading that Garfield would be leaving for the Jersey Shore, he decided to shoot him at the train station instead. Guiteau continued to stalk the president, seeking opportunities to shoot him, all the while continuing to write letters to Garfield, asking him for a job in the administration. A week before shooting him, Guiteau stalked Garfield and his wife to the train station, but held his fire as he felt sorrow at the thought of his poor wife watching her husband be gunned down right in front of her. Guiteau made one more attempt to shoot the president while he was walking through a park with James Blaine, but held back. That night, however, he resolved to shoot Garfield the next chance he got, no matter the circumstances. The opportunity came on July 2nd. Without the events of July 2nd, Charles Guiteau's wayward life, the details of which entered the public record during his trial later that year, would likely never have become a subject of historical curiosity. In my next video, I'll be taking a look at the details of the assassination itself, including an in-depth analysis of the events of the day and how they were portrayed in the series. I'll also be exploring the medical care Garfield received and weighing in on the age-old debate of whether it was really the doctors who cared for Garfield that were responsible for his death. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Please remember to leave a like and a comment, subscribe to the channel, and check out my previous videos on how the series covered Garfield's nomination and how Chester Arthur was portrayed. Until next time, this is Johnny from the One Human History channel, wishing you a fantastic day.